passports at the Supreme Court, Alfred Hitchcock on the Holocaust, and more of the Jewish news that's changing your world right now on this episode of the Week in Review. Hello, and welcome to the Jewish Channel's Week in Review. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. The United States Supreme Court is not planning to declare the precise boundaries of the State of Israel, and nor will it let Congress tell the White House what those boundaries must be either. Many were looking to a Supreme Court case this week, Zivotofsky v. Kerry, for clarity on the nature of the American relationship with Israel and how Congress intersects with it. 12-year-old Menachem Zivotofsky, the son of a prominent rabbi and U.S. citizen, was born in Jerusalem and has an American passport listing his place of birth as Jerusalem. He'd sued because the State Department would not allow him to obtain a passport that listed his place of birth as Israel. Haaretz journalist Allison Kaplan-Summer illustrated this on Facebook with passports for two of her children, who are both U.S. citizens. Her son, who was born in a Jerusalem hospital, has Jerusalem listed as his birthplace. Her daughter, born in a hospital outside Jerusalem, has her birthplace listed as Israel. The question of U.S. recognition of Jerusalem as Israeli is one that goes back to the founding of the Jewish state and the question of whether to declare Jerusalem Israel's capital and place the U.S. embassy there. Congress has on multiple occasions tried to push the White House's hand over the past few decades, and each time the White House has either had a legislative loophole or now the Supreme Court to back it up, saying that the executive branch and not Congress controls these foreign policy issues. Next, on the topic of how Israel handles children outside the Green Line, both Israel and Hamas were not included in a list of children's rights violators that the United Nations prepared. The decision not to include them was made by Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, acting over the objections of the UN Special Envoy for Children and Armed Conflict. Despite not making the list, Israel did get notice in an accompanying report saying that the 2014 Gaza war had, quote, devastating impacts for children, and added, Palestinian and Israeli children continued to be affected by the prevailing situation of military occupation, conflict, and closure. The report counted 577 Palestinian children and 4 Israeli children killed in 2014 as a result of conflict, and injuries to 4,249 Palestinian children and 22 Israeli children. Israel was also criticized this week for its lack of response to the humanitarian situation in Darfur. An investigation by Haaretz revealed that Israel has not granted a single request for asylum to Sudanese nationals, despite receiving 3,165 requests since 2009. Only 45 of the requests have even received a response. Moving on, famed director Alfred Hitchcock made a documentary about the Holocaust, and it is only now being released for the first time, as Meredith Gansman reports.
You probably don't know that filmmaker Alfred Hitchcock produced a documentary about the Holocaust right after the camps were liberated. And now, 70 years later, it's being released for the first time. The film, German Concentration Camps Factual Survey, is a British documentary shot by Allied forces in 1945 at a variety of Nazi concentration camps as they were being liberated. The Imperial War Museum recently restored and completed the film. Famed filmmaker Alfred Hitchcock, often called the master of suspense, was a director of the documentary, whose graphic images from the camps are more shocking than anything seen in Hitchcock's classic films.
Oh yes, the reality is way, way more horrible than anything which can be created.
Jose Urbach is a Holocaust survivor and artist living in Lower Manhattan, and he remembers the camps vividly. Born in Deblin, Poland in 1940, as a young boy, Urbach was deported with his parents to the Deblin ghetto, and finally to the Częstochowa concentration camp, where his father was killed just days before liberation. Urbach remembers the last time he saw his father.
There was a crack, I knew, because I knew that barrack, I spent all the time there, where I could see. And it was already dark, and I saw the men coming by, and I saw for the last time, so I saw my father one more time, because he knew about that little window. And he thought maybe my mother was there. She was not. So he turned, and when he turned, I recognized him.
The film recently premiered in New York thanks to the Blue Card, a nonprofit organization that provides financial assistance to Holocaust survivors like Urbach. Over half of the Holocaust survivors living in the United States reside in the New York metropolitan area. And the Blue Card sees the documentary as a way to expand its outreach. Associate Director of the Blue Card, Milana Basov, says,
it reaches out and it lets the public know exactly what was happening. It reaffirms the vow of never forget.
For more on the German concentration camps factual survey, tune into the full broadcast version of the Week in Review.
Thank you, Meredith. Finally, this week on Up Close, our human ambitions have brought our civilization to literally unprecedented heights, but with great damage to the world we live in. Where do we go next? To Mars, argues Silicon Valley billionaire Elon Musk, who's created a remarkably successful space company and an electric car company, and so much more. Joining us is Bloomberg Businessweek reporter Ashley Vance, who is the author of Elon Musk, Tesla, SpaceX, and the Quest for Fantastic Future. But in an approach that's literally more down to earth, one botanist suggests that Native American heritage can guide us to a better coexistence with nature if we can understand gratitude and generosity. Robin Wall-Kimmerer is a professor at the State University of New York and founder and director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, and the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants, which is now out in paperback. Here are some of the highlights from my interview with Robin Wall-Kimmerer. We know that in the loss of so many Native Americans and so much of Native American culture that broadly in America we've lost something. Right? We've lost people, we've lost heritage, we've lost a lot of things. And what you're trying to get at, I think, most here is the idea that we've lost certain wisdom.
Indeed. Not only wisdom, but wisdom which is embedded in an entire millennia-long intellectual tradition of knowing the world and our relationships to it. So what has been lost is knowledge of the land, our relationships to it, in a way that really helps people live honorably on the land.
Right. And you're coming at this from a very fascinating kind of dualistic perspective, where on the one hand, you're a botanist and professor at a university that is thoroughly immersed in kind of Western science methodologies. But then you're trying to wed that with a traditional heritage, and science does not often have much regard for traditional heritage and what it says about what works and what doesn't, and how things go.
Well, it began for me as a young person when I went to the university and found that the values and the thoughts that I had about the natural world were, as you say, dismissed in Western science. Were said, well, that's not science at all. But in fact, it is science. It is what Vine Deloria has called the intellectual twin to science. And so really my whole career has been trying to bring these multiple ways of knowing together. And I think of it as like we have two eyes, right? And our left and right eyes see something different, and it's our brain's job to reconcile those two images. And so traditional ecological knowledge of indigenous people, Western science, are two different lenses.
You wrote about one situation which you were overseeing a graduate student who specifically had a scientific theory based on hearing it from indigenous peoples, and it was rejected out of hand because, again, but what's fascinating is it's rejected out of hand because of received wisdom, right? It wasn't rejected out of hand because of empiricism. So tell that story.
We were working with a beautiful plant for which the book is named, really, sweetgrass, which is a basketry plant. And folks had come to us, native folks who are basket makers had come to us asking for some help because the plant was disappearing. We wanted to know what the effect of harvesting was on that plant. And when my student Lori Reed went to her graduate committee, they just dismissed it, and they said, anybody knows that if you harvest a plant, it's going to decline. That isn't science. This is not worthy of a thesis project. But she really persisted, and of course what the plants showed us is something that Western science would not have guessed at, but is part and parcel of traditional knowledge. That in Western science they said, well, you know, those plants, if you harvest them, they're going to decline. The plants that are going to do really well are the ones that nobody bothers, because people and nature, they're a bad mix. That's the Western paradigm. But what Lori's wonderful work showed was that, in fact, the grass that was not picked declined. And the grasses that were harvested according to traditional protocol doubled in their vitality. The plants and the people had co-evolved. The people provided a disturbance regime by which that grass could flourish. And that's just outside the Western paradigm, because Western science really thinks about people as having a negative impact on the living world, whereas one of the most important philosophical tenets of indigenous knowledge is that people are active participants in the well-being of the world.
You can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish Channel on cable. You can also listen to the full audio of Up Close as a podcast, available on iTunes or in your favorite podcast player. That's all for this week. From all of us here at the Jewish Channel, be well. The Jewish Channel is available on cable: Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, Iowakum Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast and the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.